Wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, carrying the sharp bite of pine and the promise of a brutal winter. But it was the silence of an empty cabin that finally broke Rowan Cole. For a decade, the rugged trapper had lived as a ghost among the ridges, trading human warmth for absolute solitude. Down in the valley settlement of Oak Haven, a different kind of freezing was taking place, a ruthless, calculated freezing of the human heart. 6 starving children and a desperate widow were being worked to the bone by the cruelest family in the territory. Rowan wanted nothing but peace, but the valley was about to erupt in greed and malice, and a desperate midnight plea from a dirt-smudged 14-year-old boy was about to change the trajectory of 8 lives forever. The autumn of 1887 brought an early bitter frost to the high country. Rowan Cole stood on the porch of his hand-hewn cabin, his breath pluming in the frigid morning air. At 38, he was a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he inhabited. Broad-shouldered and towering, with a thick beard and eyes the color of a stormy sky, he looked every bit the wild creature the valley folks whispered about. He wore buckskin worn smooth by time and a heavy buffalo coat that smelled of wood smoke and old snow. For 10 years, Rowan had spoken more to his 2 mules, Barnaby and Ruth, than to any living soul. He was a man who had intentionally forgotten the world. The Civil War had taken his older brother, and a bout of cholera had taken his parents shortly after he returned to a ruined home in Missouri. The mountains offered no sympathy, but they also offered no betrayal. They were honest in their cruelty, but a man could not eat pine needles, and his stores of flour, coffee, and salt were dangerously low. With a heavy sigh that seemed to rattle in his chest, Rowan loaded his pelts onto the mules and began the long, treacherous descent toward Oak Haven, a sprawling logging and ranching town that sat like a dusty scar in the valley below. The journey took 2 days. When Rowan finally led his mules down Main Street, the sensory assault of civilization hit him like a physical blow. The clinking of spurs, the rhythmic pounding of the blacksmith's hammer, the smell of cheap whiskey, and the shouting of teamsters made him clench his jaw. He kept his head down, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, steering his animals toward Elias Finch's General Mercantile. It was outside the Mercantile that Rowan's self-imposed isolation cracked. He was tying Ruth to the hitching post when he heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of a leather quirt striking flesh, followed by a woman's stifled cry. Rowan turned slowly. Across the muddy street, in front of the town's grain exchange, a woman was struggling to lift a massive burlap sack of feed onto the bed of a heavy wagon. She was painfully thin, her faded calico dress hanging off her frame like rags on a scarecrow. Her hands were raw, bleeding at the knuckles, and her face was pale, shadowed by deep exhaustion. Swarming around her were 6 children, ranging from a toddler clutching the woman's skirts to a gangly boy of about 14 who was desperately trying to take the weight of the sack from his mother. Standing over them, seated comfortably in the wagon box, was Jebediah Higgins. Jebediah was a man known throughout the territory, and not for his charity. He owned the largest cattle spread south of the river and held the deeds to half the storefronts in Oak Haven. He was a thick, red-faced man with a permanent sneer hidden beneath a walrus mustache. Beside him sat his wife, Martha, a woman with eyes like black beads and a mouth set in a permanent, disapproving line. "Pick it up, Clara," Jebediah bellowed, raising the quirt again. He didn't strike her this time, but the threat hung heavy in the air. Thomas didn't leave us with a brood of useless mouths to feed just so you could dally in the dirt. Get that feed loaded, or there won't be supper for any of these brats tonight. Clara Higgins, widow to Jebediah's late son, Thomas, bit her trembling lip and strained against the sack. The 14-year-old boy, his face dark with an impotent, quiet rage, pushed his shoulders under the burlap. "I got it, Ma." "Let go," the boy whispered fiercely. "William, no. It's too heavy for your back." Clara gasped, but her strength gave out. The sack slipped, tearing on a nail protruding from the wagon's tailgate. A stream of golden grains spilled into the muddy street. Martha Higgins shrieked from the wagon. "Look what she's done! Clumsy, useless girl! You'll pick up every kernel of that with your bare hands, Clara, or so help me God." The youngest girl, a frail child of no more than 5, began to cry. Clara dropped to her knees in the mud, frantically trying to scoop the ruined grain back into the tear, her tears mingling with the dirt. Rowan stood frozen by the hitching post. He had seen men die. He had seen the brutality of nature, but the casual, venomous cruelty of a family toward its own blood struck a discordant chord deep within his chest. He felt his large, calloused hands ball into fists. He took a step off the boardwalk, the mud sucking at his boots. Before he could cross the street, Elias Finch, the balding, spectacled storekeeper, stepped out of his shop and put a hand on Rowan's massive arm. "Don't do it, Rowan," Elias warned quietly, his eyes darting toward the Higgins wagon. "You don't want to cross Jebediah Higgins, not in this town." Rowan didn't look at Elias. His gaze was locked on Clara, who was now shielding her crying 5-year-old from Martha's sharp tongue. "Who are they?" Rowan rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "That's Clara, widow to Thomas Higgins." Elias sighed, pulling Rowan gently back toward the store. "Thomas died a year ago, trampled by a spooked horse, left her with 6 young ones. Jebediah and Martha hold the deed to the land Thomas and Clara worked. They moved Clara and the kids into a drafty shack on the edge of their main property. They treat her worse than a stray dog. Work her and the kids from sunup to sundown to pay off Thomas's debts." Rowan watched as William, the oldest boy, stood defensively in front of his mother, glaring up at his grandfather with a hatred that was too heavy for a child's face. "Why doesn't she leave?" Rowan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Leave with what? And go where?" Elias shook his head. "She's got 6 kids, Rowan. William is 14, Sarah is 12, James is 10, Mary is 8, little John is 5, and baby Cora is barely 2. Jebediah has the law in his pocket. If Clara tries to run, he'll have the sheriff arrest her for theft of his property. Or he'll declare her an unfit mother and take the older boys to work his mines, sending the little ones to the county orphanage. She's trapped in a cage, and the Higginses are holding the key." Rowan turned his back on the street, the sound of the crying children echoing in his ears. He walked into the dim, scent-filled mercantile. He had come down the mountain for flour, salt, and bullets. He told himself that was all he was leaving with. He was a mountain man. He had no business meddling in the affairs of the valley, but as he placed his pelts on the counter, the image of Clara's raw, bleeding hands picking grain out of the mud burned behind his eyes, refusing to be extinguished. Rowan concluded his business with Elias, but instead of packing his mules and heading straight back up the trail as he usually did, he found himself leading Barnaby and Ruth toward the eastern edge of town. The Higgins Ranch lay a mile outside the main settlement, a sprawling empire of fat cattle and pristine white fences. Set far back from the grand main house, near a stagnant bend in the creek, was a dilapidated, leaning timber shack. Rowan made camp in a dense grove of cottonwoods across the river on public land, telling himself he was just resting the mules before the steep climb home. He built a small, smokeless fire and brewed his coffee, but his eyes rarely left the shack through the barren branches. For 3 days, Rowan watched. What he witnessed sickened his soul. Before the sun even broke the horizon, Clara and the older children, William, Sarah, and James, were out in the freezing frost. They were tasked with breaking ice in the water troughs, mucking out the massive stables of the main house, and hauling endless cords of firewood. The younger ones, Mary and little John, were forced to pick rocks from the frozen fields, their small fingers wrapped in rags. Baby Cora was tied to Clara's back with a faded shawl as she worked. They were fed scraps. Rowan saw Martha Higgins toss out an iron pot of watery gruel into a trough meant for the hogs, pointing to it as Clara approached for the day's rations. Clara, her head bowed to hide her shame, gathered the meager slop to feed her starving children. The breaking point for Rowan came on the fourth night. A brutal wind was sweeping through the valley, carrying the first heavy snowflakes of the season. Rowan was sitting by his fire, carving a piece of pine, when he heard a commotion carrying over the wind from the Higgins property. He set his knife down, picked up his Winchester rifle from habit, and slipped through the trees, crossing the shallow, freezing river silently. He crept toward the main house, hiding behind a stack of cordwood near the stables. The back door of the grand house was thrown open, spilling yellow lamplight onto the frost-covered ground. Jebediah stood in the doorway, holding a thick ledger. Clara was on her knees at the bottom of the porch steps, shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself. Beside her stood William, his fists clenched, stepping slightly in front of his mother. "I'm telling you, Clara, my patience is at an end," Jebediah sneered, taking a drag from a cigar. "You eat my food, you live on my land, and Thomas's debts are still not paid. The boy owed $2,000 to the bank in Helena, and they're calling the note." "I am working as hard as I can, Mr. Higgins," Clara pleaded, her voice hoarse and broken. "The children are working. We will pay it. Just give us time." "Time is a luxury I don't have for freeloaders," Jebediah snapped. "I've made a decision. I spoke with Caleb Wyatt today." Clara gasped, a sound of pure terror. Even Rowan, hiding in the shadows, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. Caleb Wyatt was a notorious, ruthless rancher down near the Idaho border. He was a man of 60, known for drinking heavily and burying 3 wives under highly suspicious circumstances. "Wyatt is looking for a new wife to keep his house," Jebediah continued smoothly. "He's willing to pay a handsome dowry for a young broken-in widow, $500, and he doesn't want the baggage of 6 brats." "No!" Clara screamed, lunging forward. But William caught her, holding her back. "You can't! They are your grandchildren. They are Thomas's mistakes." Martha's voice drifted out from the warm parlor behind her husband. "They are a drain on this family. Here is how it's going to be," Jebediah dictated, slapping the ledger shut. "Tomorrow afternoon, Wyatt is coming to sign the papers. You will marry him, Clara. As for the children, the mining company up in Coeur d'Alene pays $50 a head for strong young boys. William and James will go to the mines. They can fit in the narrow shafts. Sarah and Mary will be sent to the textile mill in Spokane as indentured hands. I'll send the 2 little ones to the county ward. By tomorrow night, this ledger will be clean, and my property will be rid of you." "I'll kill you," William roared. The 14-year-old boy broke away from his mother and charged up the steps. Jebediah didn't even flinch. He simply raised a heavy boot and kicked the boy squarely in the chest. William flew backward, crashing into the frozen dirt with a sickening thud, gasping for air. "William!" Clara shrieked, crawling to her son and covering his body with hers. "Have them packed and ready by noon tomorrow," Jebediah commanded coldly. "If you try to run, I'll have the sheriff hunt you down for stealing the clothes on your backs, and I'll see William hanged for assaulting me. Consider yourselves lucky I'm sorting out your miserable lives." The heavy oak door slammed shut, plunging the yard back into darkness, save for the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow. Rowan watched from the woodpile as Clara rocked her gasping son in the dirt, the muffled cries of the woman tearing through the howling wind. Dangerous fury ignited in Rowan's blood. He had spent 10 years running from the pain of losing his own family. He had built walls of ice and stone around his heart. But watching a mother and her children being systematically destroyed by greed shattered every wall he had built. He waited until Clara helped William up, and they limped back to the freezing shack. Rowan retreated to his camp across the river. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the dying embers, his mind racing. He was a mountain man. He lived in a one-room cabin perched on a cliff edge. He barely had enough provisions for himself. How could he possibly intervene? If he shot Jebediah Higgins, he would hang, and the children would still be orphaned. If he tried to steal them away in the night, the law would hunt him down as a kidnapper, and he couldn't outrun a posse with a woman and 6 children in the dead of winter. There was only one legal, binding way to sever Jebediah's claim over Clara. Rowan looked at his calloused hands. He looked at the vast, lonely wilderness that awaited him. He had chosen this life to avoid the pain of loss. But as the dawn began to break, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, Rowan knew that walking away from this would be a death of the soul far worse than any physical demise. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving a heavy, silent blanket over the valley. Rowan did not pack his mules. Instead, he took his axe and walked down to the frozen riverbank, ostensibly to chop firewood, but keeping himself in clear view of the Higgins shack. He needed them to know he was there. He needed to find a way to speak to Clara without alerting the main house. Around 10 Uis, he noticed movement. 2 small figures slipped out the back window of the shack, using the snowdrifts to mask their approach toward the tree line. Rowan kept chopping, allowing the rhythmic thwack of the axe to cover the sound of their crunching footsteps. When he finally turned, he found William and 12-year-old Sarah standing 10 feet away. Both were shivering uncontrollably. They wore boots, with holes stuffed with old newspaper, and threadbare coats that offered no protection against the biting cold. Sarah's face was bruised, likely from a backhand from Martha, and William moved stiffly, nursing the ribs his grandfather had kicked the night before. William stepped forward. Despite his youth, there was a hardened, desperate age in his eyes. He looked at the massive mountain man, his gaze flicking to the large hunting knife at Rowan's belt, then up to his bearded face. "You're Rowan Cole, ain't you?" William asked, his teeth chattering. "Elias Finch said you were camped out here. Said you're the Bear of Bitterroot. Said you ain't afraid of nobody." Rowan rested the heavy head of the axe on the snow. He looked down at the boy. "Finch talks too much. What are you doing out here, boy? Your grandfather catches you over here, he'll tan your hide." "He's going to do worse than that today," William said, his voice cracking, betraying his terror. "You saw him last night. I saw you hiding by the woodpile." Rowan raised an eyebrow. The boy was observant. "I saw," Rowan admitted quietly. Sarah grabbed her brother's sleeve, pulling him back slightly. "William, maybe we shouldn't." "We ain't got a choice, Sarah," William snapped, though his tone was laced with panic, not anger. He turned back to Rowan, stepping closer. "Mr. Cole, Caleb Wyatt is coming at noon. He's bringing the town lawyer, Josiah Crane. Once those papers are signed, my mother belongs to Wyatt, and we belong to the mines and the mills. We're going to be split up. We'll never see each other again." "I know," Rowan said, his voice gentle despite its deep rumble. "It's a hard hand you've been dealt, son, but I don't know what you expect a trapper to do about it. Jebediah has the law on his side. He has the law because my mother is a widow living on his charity, William said rapidly, the words tumbling out of him as if he had rehearsed them all night. My pa, Thomas, he didn't leave a will, so the property reverted to my grandfather. The only way my mother is free from Jebediah's guardianship is if she's under the protection of a new husband. Rowan went incredibly still. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. He looked at the boy, truly looked at him, realizing the absolute, terrifying gravity of what this 14-year-old was about to propose. "We ain't got money, Mr. Cole," William continued, tears finally welling in his eyes, though he fought furiously to blink them away. "We ain't got nothing but the clothes on our backs. But we are hard workers. Me and James, we know how to clear brush, chop wood, mend fences. Sarah and Mary, they can cook and sew better than grown women. Even little John can fetch water. If you take us away from here, if you take us up to your mountain, we will work for you until our dying breath. We will be your hands and your feet. We won't be a burden." William swallowed hard, taking one final shuddering step forward. He looked directly into the eyes of the towering mountain man, laying his pride, his childhood, and his family's entire existence at Rowan's feet. "Please," William whispered, the word tearing out of his throat. "Please, marry our mother." Silence stretched between them, heavy and profound. Rowan looked from William's pleading, desperate eyes to Sarah, who was silently weeping, her small hands clasped together as if in prayer. A family of 7, a widow who was likely broken in spirit, and 6 children traumatized by grief and abuse. Rowan lived in a cabin that was barely large enough for one man. He lived a life of constant danger, fighting off grizzlies, surviving avalanches, and hunting for every meal. To take on a wife and 6 children wasn't just a monumental responsibility. It was an act of absolute madness. It meant giving up his sanctuary. It meant confronting Jebediah Higgins, Caleb Wyatt, and the town's corrupt legal system. Rowan closed his eyes, the cold wind biting at his weathered face. He thought of his empty cabin. He thought of the silence that deafened him every night. He thought of his own mother, dying of cholera, holding his hand and telling him to look after his brother, a promise he couldn't keep when the war took him. He opened his eyes. He looked at William, seeing the ghost of his own brother in the boy's defiant stance. "Your mother," Rowan said slowly, his voice raspy. "Does she know you're out here asking me this?" William shook his head. "No, sir. She's inside packing our things and crying. She thinks it's over. But if you offer, if you show up with the preacher before Caleb Wyatt gets here, she'll do it. She'll do anything to keep us together." Rowan reached out, his massive, leather-gloved hand resting gently on William's trembling shoulder. The boy flinched at first, used to violence from grown men, but relaxed slightly at the steady, surprisingly gentle pressure. "Go back to your shack," Rowan commanded quietly. "Don't tell your mother where you've been. Tell her to stall her packing." "Mr. Cole?" Sarah asked, her voice a tiny squeak. "I need to go see Elias Finch," Rowan said, pulling his hat down tight against the wind. He grabbed his axe and turned toward his camp to fetch his mules. "And then I need to find the preacher. Be ready when I get there, all of you." William's face broke into a mixture of absolute shock and overwhelming relief. He grabbed Sarah's hand, and the 2 children fled back across the snow, slipping through the window of the shack just as Martha Higgins came out the back door of the main house to yell for them. Rowan walked quickly to his camp. The solitary mountain man was dead. He was about to declare war on the most powerful family in the valley, and he had exactly 2 hours to orchestrate a wedding before Caleb Wyatt arrived to buy a family. The clock inside Elias Finch's General Mercantile read 10:30 when Rowan Cole threw open the heavy wooden door. The bell above it jingled frantically, a sharp contrast to the grim set of the mountain man's jaw. Elias dropped a bolt of calico cloth, his eyes widening at the sight of Rowan's face. It was the face of a man walking into a storm with no intention of seeking shelter. "Rowan?" Elias asked, his voice wavering. "Did you forget your salt?" "I need you, Elias," Rowan said, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that commanded the room. "And I need Clear's throat, Reverend Stokes, right now." Elias adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly. "The Reverend? Rowan, what in God's name are you planning?" "I'm taking a wife," Rowan stated flatly, slapping a heavy worn leather pouch onto the counter. The sound it made was unmistakable, the dull, heavy thud of raw gold. "And I need you to stand as a witness. Fetch the Reverend. Tell him a widow's salvation depends on his speed." By 11:45, a strange procession made its way up the snow-packed road toward the Higgins estate. Rowan led his 2 mules, his Winchester rifle resting casually but deliberately across his forearm. Behind him walked a highly anxious Elias Finch and a breathless, bewildered Reverend Stokes, his Bible clutched tightly to his chest. As they crested the rise leading to the main ranch house, the scene unfolding in the frozen yard confirmed William's desperate warning. A sleek black buggy was parked near the dilapidated shack. Standing beside it was Caleb Wyatt, a man whose expensive broadcloth coat could not hide the cruelty etched into his ruddy, pockmarked face. Beside him stood Josiah Crane, the town's weasel-faced lawyer, holding a stack of crisp white papers. On the porch of the shack stood Clara, clutching baby Cora to her chest. Her face was an ashen mask of pure terror. William and James stood rigidly in front of their mother, while the girls and little John huddled behind her skirts, crying silently. Jebediah and Martha Higgins watched from the steps of their grand house, looking entirely pleased with the transaction about to occur. "Just sign the paper, Clara," Caleb Wyatt drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the pristine snow. "I ain't got all day, and it's too cold to be standing around waiting on a woman to find her senses." The 2 older boys go to the mining company cart at the end of the lane. The rest of the brats go to the county wagon. Clara took a shuddering breath, her trembling hand reaching for the pen Josiah Crane held out. She looked at William, a silent, agonizing goodbye passing between them. "Put the pen down, Mr. Crane," a voice boomed across the yard, carrying over the whistling wind like the crack of a falling redwood. Every head turned. Rowan Cole stepped into the yard, his massive frame casting a long, dark shadow over the snow. The casual way he held his rifle, coupled with the absolute deadliness in his stormy eyes, made the ranch hands lingering near the barn instinctively step backward. Jebediah Higgins's face purpled with rage. "Cole, what is the meaning of this? You are trespassing on private property." Rowan ignored the wealthy rancher entirely. He didn't look at Caleb Wyatt or the lawyer. His eyes found Clara. He walked steadily toward the porch of the shack, the snow crunching heavily under his boots. He stopped 10 feet away, removing his wide-brimmed hat to expose his thick, dark hair to the falling snow. "Ma'am," Rowan said, his voice surprisingly gentle, as he addressed the terrified widow. "My name is Rowan Cole. I live a hard life up in the Bitter Roots. I don't have a grand house, and I don't have much to offer but the sweat of my brow and the roof of my cabin." Clara stared at him, bewildered, pulling Cora tighter against her thin coat. I don't understand." Rowan looked at William, who gave a nearly imperceptible, desperate nod. Rowan turned back to Clara. "Your boy William came to me. He told me what's happening here today. Ma'am, a mother shouldn't be parted from her children, not for debt, and certainly not for the convenience of cruel men. Caleb Wyatt took an angry step forward, his hand dropping toward the revolver at his hip. Listen here, mountain trash. This woman is spoken for. The deal is struck. Before Wyatt's fingers could even brush the handle of his gun, the lever of Rowan's Winchester clicked with a sharp, metallic clack. The barrel didn't raise, but the threat was absolute. Step back, Wyatt, or the only thing you'll be marrying today is a plot in the Oak Haven Cemetery. Wyatt froze, his face draining of color. Rowan turned his full attention back to Clara. Mrs. Higgins, Rowan said, his voice steady and respectful, I brought Reverend Stokes. If you will have me, I will marry you right here, right now. The law says a married woman and her children fall under the protection of her husband. Jebediah Higgins will have no legal right to separate your family, and Wyatt will have no claim to you. A stunned silence fell over the freezing yard, broken only by the sharp cries of the baby. Clara's eyes darted frantically from the hulking mountain man to her father-in-law, and then down to William. He'll save us, Ma, William whispered fiercely, tears freezing on his cheeks. He promised. This is an outrage, Jebediah roared, marching down his porch steps. You think you can just walk onto my land and steal my property? She owes a $2,000 debt to the Helena Bank. As her guardian, I hold the note. Unless you've got $2,000 in that filthy coat, Cole, she belongs to me until the debt is paid. Josiah Crane, emboldened by Jebediah's shouting, adjusted his spectacles. Mr. Higgins is correct, legally speaking. The debt must be satisfied, or the guardianship stands, and he has the right to arrange her affairs to settle it. Rowan didn't blink. He reached into his deep coat pocket and pulled out the heavy leather pouch he had shown Elias. He tossed it onto the frozen ground at Josiah Crane's feet. It hit with a heavy metallic thud, the leather ties loosening to reveal the glint of dull yellow stones. There's nearly 50 oz of raw bitterroot gold in that pouch, Crane, Rowan stated coldly. At current assay, that's well over $2,000. The debt is paid in full. Write the receipt. Jebediah's jaw went slack. The ranch hands muttered in shock. Even Clara let out a small gasp. A mountain man pulling thousands of dollars in raw gold from his coat was a twist no one, not even Elias Finch, had anticipated. Write the receipt, Crane, Rowan repeated, the danger in his voice spiking. Or do we need to have a conversation about extortion and the legal definitions of slavery in the Montana Territory? Crane scrambled to pick up the pouch, his greedy eyes wide as he assessed the weight. He nodded frantically to Jebediah. It's more than enough, Mr. Higgins. The debt is satisfied. Jebediah looked as though he might have a stroke. He had lost his free labor. He had lost the $500 bounty from Wyatt. And he had been humiliated on his own land. Rowan looked back at Clara, who was weeping openly now. Mrs. Higgins? He asked softly. My offer stands, but the choice is yours. Clara Higgins had spent the last year entirely devoid of hope. Since Thomas's death, she had been a ghost haunting her own life, watching her children wither under the tyrannical rule of her in-laws. She had resigned herself to her fate, believing God had simply turned his back on the Higgins shack. Now, looking up at the towering bearded man who had just bought her family's freedom with a pouch of gold and a loaded rifle, she felt a terrifying spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Survival. She looked at her children. 6 frightened, freezing faces looking to her for salvation. She didn't know Rowan Cole. He could be a madman. He could be as cruel as Jebediah. But he had defended her son. and he was offering to keep them together. Clara's voice was a ragged whisper. She cleared her throat, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. I will marry you, Mr. Cole. Reverend Stokes, shivering in his thin coat, hurried forward, opening his Bible with numb fingers. Well then, let us be quick about it. The cold is biting. It was the strangest, most desolate wedding Oak Haven had ever seen. There were no flowers, no music, and no joy. The bride wore a threadbare coat and held a crying infant. The groom held a Winchester rifle in one hand and took her freezing raw hand with the other. The congregation consisted of 6 starving children, a terrified storekeeper, and a yard full of furious, humiliated enemies. Do you, Rowan Cole, take this woman, Clara Higgins, to be your lawfully wedded wife? The Reverend's teeth chattered as he read the abridged vows. I do, Rowan said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. And do you, Clara, take this man? Clara looked into Rowan's stormy gray eyes. She saw no warmth there yet, but she saw an immovable granite strength. I do. Then, by the power vested in me by God and the territory of Montana, I pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined, let no man put asunder. Rowan didn't kiss her. It wasn't the time, nor the place. He simply gave her hand a brief, reassuring squeeze before turning to face Jebediah. She is Clara Cole now, Rowan announced, his voice carrying an undeniable finality. And these children are under my roof. If you, your wife, or any of your men ever approach them again, I will not bother bringing a lawyer next time. Caleb Wyatt spat in the snow, turning on his heel. You're a fool, Cole. You just bought yourself a whole lot of starving mouths. You'll all freeze to death up on that mountain. He climbed into his buggy and whipped the horse, tearing out of the yard. Jebediah Higgins said nothing. The hatred in his eyes was a physical force, but he was beaten, and he knew it. He turned and marched back into his grand house, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. Pack your things, Rowan told Clara, his tone shifting to a brisk, commanding clip. Only what you can carry. We have a long climb ahead of us, and the weather is turning. We don't have much, Clara admitted, her voice trembling as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Bring the blankets. Bring whatever boots the children have, Rowan said. While they packed, Elias Finch approached Rowan, looking deeply troubled. Rowan, you can't take 6 kids up the Bitterroot Trail in this weather. They don't have the coats for it. They'll freeze before you hit the halfway mark. Rowan knew Elias was right. Elias, I need a favor, a big one. Half an hour later, Rowan and his new family were standing outside Finch's Mercantile in town. Elias had practically emptied his back room. He outfitted Clara and the children in heavy wool coats, lined boots, and thick mittens, putting the entire sum on a ledger under Rowan's name. I'll bring you pelts in the spring, Elias, Rowan promised, securing the last bundle to Ruth, his pack mule. Just keep them alive, Rowan, Elias said grimly, looking at the young children who were looking up at the towering mountains with wide, fearful eyes. That's payment enough. With Clara mounted on Barnaby, holding baby Cora and 5-year-old little John, and the older children walking in the pack trail behind them, Rowan Cole led his new, massive family out of Oak Haven. He had descended the mountain a solitary, bitter man. He was returning as a husband and a father to 6. The trail up into the Bitterroot Mountains was not meant for a family. It was a rugged, narrow path cut by elk and hardened trappers, winding dangerously along sheer drop-offs and through dense, light-stealing pine forests. By mid-afternoon, the temperature plummeted, and the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons like a wounded animal. Rowan led the way on foot, breaking the trail through the deepening snow. William and James marched behind him, their new wool coats heavy but warm, their faces pale with exertion. Sarah held 8-year-old Mary's hand tightly, pulling her along when the younger girls stumbled. Clara rode in silence, her arms aching from holding the two youngest, her mind reeling from the surreal, terrifying turn her life had taken in a matter of hours. The challenges of the climb, the cold, the wind chill was dropping rapidly. Rowan had to call frequent halts just to check the children's fingers and noses for frostbite. The terrain, ice patches hidden beneath the fresh snow, made every step treacherous. Once, Barnaby slipped, his back legs sliding toward the edge of a ravine. Rowan threw his massive weight against the mule's shoulder, roaring a command that stabilized the beast just in time. Clara had squeezed her eyes shut, praying into the baby's blankets. Exhaustion? These children were malnourished and overworked. By the 3rd hour of the steep climb, James, the 10-year-old, collapsed in the snow, weeping silently from exhaustion. Rowan didn't yell. He didn't berate the boy, as Jedediah would have. He walked back, handed his rifle to William, and scooped James up with one arm, carrying the 80-pound boy as easily as if he were a sack of flour. "Rest your legs, son," Rowan rumbled, shifting the boy's weight onto his broad back. "I've got you." Clara watched this from atop the mule, a tight, painful knot in her chest. A knot made of grief and fear began to loosen just a fraction. This wild, terrifying man was carrying her son, but the mountain had one more twist for them before they reached the sanctuary of the cabin. As they entered a narrow gorge known as Dead Man's Pass, the fading light played tricks on the eyes. The wind was deafening. Rowan suddenly stopped, his hand shooting up in a silent command to halt. He lowered James to the ground and took his Winchester back from William. "Stay behind the mules," Rowan ordered Clara, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Keep the kids down." Through the swirling snow ahead, 3 figures materialized, blocking the narrow pass. They were mounted on heavily breathing horses. As they drew closer, Rowan recognized the expensive coats and the arrogant sneers. It was 3 of Caleb Wyatt's ranch hands. They were drunk, angry, and heavily armed. "Well, look here," the lead rider slurred, pulling a repeater rifle from his saddle scabbard. The mountain man and his new brood. "Mr. Wyatt wasn't too happy about being made a fool of today, Cole. He sent us to collect a toll for the road." "There is no toll on public land," Rowan stated, stepping out in front of his family, making himself a massive, undeniable target. "There is today," the second rider laughed, cocking his pistol. "We figure that gold pouch you threw at Crane wasn't the only one you got hidden in that coat. You hand over your gold, and maybe we'll leave the widow and the brats alive. Might even take the pretty little older girl back to Wyatt for his trouble." At the threat to 12-year-old Sarah, William let out a feral yell and tried to rush forward, but Clara grabbed his coat, dragging him down into the snow behind the mule. Rowan didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. The Bear of Bitterroot did not play games when his territory or his people were threatened. Before the drunk riders could fully raise their weapons, Rowan's Winchester barked. Crack, crack. He didn't shoot to kill. He shot to disarm and terrify. The first bullet shattered the wooden stock of the lead rider's rifle, sending splinters flying into the man's face. The second bullet struck the pommel of the second rider's saddle inches from his leg, the sound echoing like a cannon blast in the narrow gorge. The horses panicked. They reared up, screaming in terror, throwing the second rider into a snowdrift. The lead rider dropped his ruined rifle, fighting to control his bucking mount. "The next one goes between your eyes," Rowan roared, racking the lever of his rifle with lightning speed, the brass casing ejecting into the snow. He took 2 thunderous steps forward, looking like an ancient god of war rising from the ice. "Ride back to Wyatt and tell him Rowan Cole claims this mountain. If I see your faces on this trail again, I will feed you to the wolves. Ride!" Terrified by the sheer violence of the man and the ringing in their ears, the ranch hands didn't wait. The dismounted man scrambled onto the back of his companion's horse, and the 3 of them tore back down the trail, disappearing into the whiteout. Silence slammed back into the gorge, save for the wind. Rowan stood breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the tree line for any stragglers. Satisfied they were gone, he lowered the rifle and turned back to his family. Clara was staring at him, her eyes wide, a mixture of awe and absolute terror on her face. The children were huddled together, shaking. "Are you hurt?" Rowan asked, his voice returning to its calm, deep rumble, as if he hadn't just fought off 3 armed men. "No," Clara stammered. "We are all right." Rowan nodded. He picked James back up and slung him over his shoulder. "We're almost there. Just 1 more mile." When they finally crested the final ridge, the sun had fully set, and the world was bathed in moonlight reflecting off the snow. Nestled against a sheer rock face, protected from the worst of the wind, was Rowan's cabin. Smoke was curling lazily from the stone chimney, a result of the slow-burning oak log he had left that morning. It was small, it was rugged, but as Rowan pushed open the heavy timber door and ushered the freezing, exhausted family of 7 into the warm, fire-lit interior, Clara felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. She felt safe. The first month inside the cabin was a delicate, freezing dance of survival and boundaries. Rowan Cole's home, built for a solitary trapper, was a single, sturdy room of peeled logs, chinked with mud and horsehair. It boasted a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall, a heavy oak table, a single cast-iron stove, and a bed tucked into the far corner. Suddenly, it held 8 souls. Rowan gave the bed to Clara, baby Cora, and little John. He built a sturdy, multi-tiered bunk system along the opposite wall for the older children, using split pine and heavy canvas. As for Rowan himself, he claimed a spot on the braided rug directly before the hearth, wrapping himself in his thick buffalo robe. It was an arrangement born of pure necessity, but the physical closeness forced a rapid thawing of the emotional distance between them. The children, accustomed to the sharp backhand of their grandparents, flinched whenever Rowan moved too quickly, or his deep voice boomed. But Rowan proved to be a man of profound, quiet patience. He did not demand their affection. He simply provided for them. When the blizzards raged outside, trapping them indoors for days at a time, Rowan taught William and James how to whittle, turning chunks of raw cedar into intricate figures of bears, eagles, and horses. He showed Sarah and Mary how to mend his heavy canvas traps and oil his leather gear, treating their work with a grave respect they had never experienced. The transformation in Clara was the most profound. Removed from the crushing, humiliating weight of Jedediah Higgins's thumb, the frail, exhausted widow began to bloom. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, thanks to a steady diet of venison, dried berries, and the flour Rowan had hauled up the mountain. She possessed a quiet, resilient strength that fascinated Rowan. She took over the chaotic cabin, bringing order, warmth, and the smell of baking bread to a space that had only ever known the harsh scents of smoke and raw hides. The unspoken tension between Rowan and Clara, however, vibrated like a plucked fiddle string. They were legally bound, yet essentially strangers sharing a confined space. The turning point came on a bitter night in late January. Rowan had been out checking his closest trap lines in waist-deep snow and returned shivering. A deep, jagged gash on his forearm where a desperate wolverine had caught him before expiring. He tried to bind it himself by the fire, his jaw clenched against the pain, not wanting to wake the sleeping children. "Let me," a soft voice whispered. Clara slipped out of the corner bed, pulling a knitted shawl tight over her shoulders. She knelt beside him on the rug, bringing a basin of warm water from the stove and clean boiled rags. Rowan stiffened as her cool, gentle fingers touched his bloodied arm. He was unaccustomed to care. He watched her face in the flickering firelight, the intense concentration, the soft furrow of her brow, the stray lock of hair falling across her cheek. "You take too much onto your own shoulders, Rowan," Clara murmured, washing the wound with steady hands. "You have a family now. You don't have to bleed alone." Rowan looked down at her, the walls he had built around his heart for 10 long years finally, irrevocably, cracking. "I'm not used to having anything worth bleeding for, Clara." She paused, looking up into his stormy gray eyes. For the first time, there was no fear in her gaze, only a profound, grounding warmth. "We are yours," she said simply, "and you are ours. We survived this mountain together." From that night on, the dynamic shifted. The marriage of convenience began to root itself in a deep, unspoken devotion. Rowan began leaving small offerings on the table for her. A perfectly clear quartz crystal he found near the creek, a handful of dried wintergreen leaves for her tea. Clara, in return, began knitting him a new, thick wool sweater from yarn she unraveled and respun, ensuring it was large enough to fit his massive frame. By the time the first signs of the thaw appeared, the 8 people in the cabin were no longer a desperate mountain man and a broken family. They were the Coles. Spring did not arrive gently in the Bitterroots. It violently tore the winter away. The ice on the high creeks shattered with the sound of gunfire, and the snowmelt sent roaring torrents of freezing water down the mountainsides. The air grew sweet with the scent of wet pine needles and blooming beargrass. For the children, the thaw was a revelation. William, now a broad-shouldered 15-year-old, spent his days hunting alongside Rowan, learning to read the wind and track elk through the muddy timber. Sarah and Mary gathered wild onions and bitterroot, their laughter echoing through the pines, a sound Rowan realized he had come to crave. But the melting snow also meant the trail to Oak Haven was passable once more. Rowan knew the peace was temporary. A man like Jedediah Higgins did not swallow humiliation easily, and Caleb Wyatt did not forgive a stolen bride. In late May, Rowan's precautions paid off. He had strung a series of thin, nearly invisible wires across the lower canyon trail, attached to a crude but effective alarm of tin cups, hung in a hollow tree near the cabin. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the clatter of the tin cups rang out, sharp and frantic. Rowan, who was chopping firewood near the porch, dropped his axe. He looked at William, who immediately sprinted to gather the younger children playing near the creek. Clara stepped out of the cabin, her face pale but her jaw set in a hard, determined line. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and reached behind the door, pulling out the double-barreled shotgun Rowan had taught her to load and fire. "Inside," Rowan commanded, his voice deadly calm. "Bar the heavy shutters. Do not open the door unless you hear my voice." "Rowan," Clara started, stepping toward him. He took her face in his large, rough hands, pressing a fierce, sudden kiss to her forehead. "I made a vow to protect you, Clara. I intend to keep it. Get the children inside." Rowan grabbed his Winchester and a bandolier of cartridges. He didn't stay at the cabin. Instead, he melted into the dense tree line flanking the clearing, climbing a massive, ancient cedar that offered a clear vantage point of the trail leading up to his property. Half an hour later, the riders broke through the timber. There were 6 of them. Jedediah Higgins rode at the front, his face red and sweating in the spring heat. Beside him was Caleb Wyatt, looking eager for blood. Behind them rode a corrupt, heavy-set deputy from the county seat named Miller, and 3 hired guns with low-slung revolvers and dirty dusters. They reined their horses to a halt at the edge of the clearing, staring at the seemingly deserted, heavily shuttered cabin. "Cole!" Jedediah bellowed, his voice echoing off the rock face. "We know you're in there. Come out and face the law." Deputy Miller spurred his horse forward a few paces. "Rowan Cole, I have a warrant here for your arrest. Charges are kidnapping, theft of property, and assault. Bring the woman and the children out, and nobody has to get hurt." Silence answered them. The wind rustled the high branches, and a raven called out sharply. Caleb Wyatt pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "He's a coward, Higgins. Let's just burn the shack down and smoke him out. The woman and the brats will run out when the roof catches." Wyatt spurred his horse, raising his rifle, intending to ride up to the porch. Crack. The shot came from the canopy above, so fast and precise that no one saw the flash. The bullet struck the dirt exactly 1 inch in front of Wyatt's horse's hooves. The animal shrieked, rearing violently and dumping Wyatt backward into the spring mud. "That was a warning, Wyatt," Rowan's voice boomed, seemingly coming from the very mountain itself. The men frantically aimed their weapons into the trees, but the dense foliage and shifting shadows made the mountain man invisible. "The next one takes your ear. The one after that takes your life." Panic rippled through the posse. The hired guns nervously backed their horses toward the tree line, realizing they were sitting ducks in the open clearing against a ghost who knew every inch of the high country. "You're a dead man, Cole!" Jedediah screamed, drawing his own pistol, though his hand shook. "She is my ward. Those children belong in the mines. You can't hide behind trees forever." From inside the cabin, a sound stopped Jedediah cold. The heavy wooden bar of the front door scraped back. Rowan tensed in the tree, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Clara! No!" he thought frantically. The heavy door swung open. Clara Cole stepped out onto the porch. She did not look like the terrified, starving widow who had stood in the snow 6 months prior. She stood tall, her chin raised, holding the heavy double-barreled shotgun leveled squarely at her former father-in-law's chest. Behind her, standing in the shadows of the doorway, was William, holding Rowan's spare hunting rifle. "Clara!" Jedediah shouted, his shock momentarily overriding his anger. "Put that fool thing down and get out here. We've come to rescue you from this savage." "There is nothing to rescue me from, Jedediah," Clara's voice rang out, clear and unyielding. It was the voice of a mountain woman. "Rowan Cole is my lawful husband. These children are his family. You have no claim on us. You never did. You only had chains, and Rowan broke them." "He kidnapped you," Deputy Miller yelled, trying to assert his fading authority. "He stole gold to pay a debt." "He paid Thomas's debt, fair and square," Clara fired back. Josiah Crane signed the receipt. "As for kidnapping, I walked up this mountain of my own free will to escape a monster who was going to sell my children into slavery. If you take one more step onto my husband's land, Deputy, you'll find out just how well he taught me to shoot." Caleb Wyatt, having scrambled to his feet, aimed his rifle at Clara. "Stupid! I'll put a bullet in you right now and take the older girl anyway." Wyatt never finished his sentence. Rowan didn't shoot Wyatt. He shot the massive dead widowmaker pine branch hanging directly over where Wyatt and the deputy stood. The heavy-caliber bullet shattered the rotting joint, holding the 1,000-ton elb log to the trunk. With a sickening crack, the massive timber plummeted. It didn't hit the men directly, but it crashed into the muddy ground between their horses with the force of a bomb. sending an explosion of mud, rock, and splinters into the air. The horses lost their minds. The hired guns' mounts bolted, tearing back down the trail toward Oak Haven, ignoring their riders' frantic swearing. Deputy Miller's horse bucked him into the brush before fleeing. Wyatt, covered in mud and terrified out of his wits, scrambled on foot after the fleeing animals. Only Jedediah was left, struggling to control his terrified gelding. He looked at the shattered timber, then up at the canopy where the invisible sniper waited, and finally back to Clara, who hadn't flinched, the shotgun still aimed at his heart. "You have no power here, Jedediah," Clara said quietly, but the words carried the weight of an avalanche. "Go back to your empty house. If you ever come up this mountain again, Rowan won't shoot the trees, and neither will I." Jedediah Higgins looked at the woman he had broken, seeing a force of nature he could no longer control. His face contorted with impotent rage, but the absolute certainty of his own death if he stayed forced his hand. He yanked the reins hard, turning his horse, and spurred it mercilessly down the trail, fleeing his own humiliation. Rowan swung down from the cedar tree, landing lightly in the mud. He walked into the clearing, his eyes locked on his wife. Clara lowered the shotgun, her hands shaking slightly now that the danger had passed, but her eyes shone with fierce, triumphant tears. Rowan stepped onto the porch. He took the heavy weapon from her hands, leaning it against the wall, and pulled her roughly into his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, his massive arms wrapping around her as if trying to shield her from the very wind. "You are a terrifying woman, Clara Cole," Rowan murmured against her temple, his voice thick with an emotion he had thought long dead. Clara wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against the steady, thumping drum of his heart. "I learned from the Bear of Bitterroot," she whispered back, a wet smile pressing against his shirt. William stepped out onto the porch, flanked by the rest of the children, who poured out of the cabin like a flood, wrapping their small arms around Rowan's legs and Clara's waist. They stood together on the porch, an impenetrable fortress of flesh, blood, and chosen love, watching the dust settle on the trail below. The legend of Rowan Cole and the standoff at Bitterroot spread through Oak Haven like wildfire, permanently cementing the mountain man's reputation. Jedediah Higgins, humiliated and broken by his own greed, eventually sold his vast estate and moved back east, leaving the valley in peace. Caleb Wyatt never dared cross the river again. Up on the mountain, the tiny one-room cabin did not remain small for long. Over the next 5 years, Rowan and William, working side by side as father and son, felled the great pines and expanded the home. They built a sprawling, sturdy lodge with enough rooms for a growing family, a wide porch that looked out over the valley, and a hearth large enough to warm them all. Clara transformed the harsh wilderness into a sanctuary of laughter, warmth, and unyielding love. Rowan Cole had descended the mountain, a lonely ghost seeking an end to his solitude, but through a desperate plea and a defiant stand, he built an empire of the heart that not even the harshest winter could freeze.